raise your hand. Well, I think we're about ready to get started. I don't know if our microphones all working? They're working on it. Testing, hello. Well, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? We're good shape? Almost hear me. Oh, some of my people are already screaming at me. Well, I'm John Toole, the Executive Director and CEO at the Computer History Museum, and I want to welcome everyone. A lot of new faces, and it's really an exciting evening with Regis McKenna. Before we introduce Regis later on in a few minutes, I want to give you a little bit of background about the museum. But first, you may notice that we actually have a co-host this evening with our lecture series. In fact, this lecture concludes our spring lecture series. We're going to take a little bit of a break for the summer, but we've got some exciting things planned for the summer that we can tell you about a little bit later. Cynthia Holliday is the really the person responsible for the Silicon Valley chapter of the American Marketing Association. And I want to introduce Cynthia, and if you might want to come up and just say a couple of words about the Marketing Association.
Thank you. I just want to thank John and also Karen Matthews and Pam Cleveland and the rest of the team for giving us the opportunity to collaborate on this program this evening, which is so appropriate, and have an illustrious speaker. For those of you who may not know about the American Marketing Association, we are the local chapter of the largest professional nonprofit association of marketers in the world. And we offer programs, career development, networking opportunities throughout Silicon Valley. And our mission is to advance marketing excellence throughout Silicon Valley, and also to raise awareness to what the true value of marketing is in a high-tech environment, which I think Regis will talk to us about tonight. So if you are interested in getting involved or learning about the kind of programs that we have, you can look on our website, www.svama.org. And thank you for coming tonight, and thanks, everybody.
Great. And we met Cynthia at a previous lecture with Charlie Bachman, a Turing Award winner had given, that Cynthia actually had worked with Charlie and his company in some of the older days. And we really hit it off, and I'm really happy and proud to have the American Marketing Association local chapter here this evening. I wanted to give you a little bit of some of our background on our museum quickly, and I'm going to do a little bit newer things than some of you may have seen, so bear with me on a couple of the things. But really, our role, and I hope most of you have probably seen our visible storage exhibit area over at NASA Ames in Building 126, is really to preserve the artifacts and stories of the information age, something that's really being lost day in and day out. Many of these artifacts for which many of us have lived through, and the stories in particular, many of which I hope we'll hear tonight from Regis's experience and different points of view, are really being lost. And we really take it as our passion, as this is our mission, to be able to preserve those artifacts and stories. We are currently housed in a very cramped area in Building 126. We have public tours Wednesdays and Fridays, and Saturdays, the first and third Saturdays of each month, that kind of get to see up close and personal some of those things that really made it all happen, that were the objects of success or failure, for the case may be, and of course many objects for the marketing groups to really go after in many different dimensions. And I think it's a really up close and personal experience, both from some of the things you may see from the supercomputer lines, the personal computer lines, and over history from the 70s on, at least my own experience, of course. And many of you may go back earlier or later. It's quite an endeavor, and something that I think is really empowering in terms of what the computing industry and the information industry can really do. We really have very dense warehouse space. We have this exhibit warehouse, exhibit visible storage area, and some very cramped office space right now. We really have a great staff and volunteers, many of which hopefully you'll meet this evening. Karen Matthews, my Executive Vice President, David Miller in the back, the VP of Development, and Pam Cleveland. Many of the staff are around here, hopefully serving you to meet your needs this evening and throughout the rest of the whole enterprise. And we have an architect and exhibit team that we're really thinking about our future, and that really is what it's all about, because we're not really comfortable where we are today, because we realize we need more space. We want to move into something better. We want to be able to exhibit and produce an exhibition really worthy of both the stories, the people, and the artifacts, and how they all come together. So what I thought I would do today, just to be a little bit different than some of you have seen, is give you a little snippet and a teaser of some of the things that we're doing on the exhibit design phase, and the challenge that we really have to be able to pull it all together that makes us a museum and makes us real. This is just, for example, a panel of something. Could you imagine if you were looking at the 30s, and I'm going to talk about the old days here, if I may, of some of the things that we maybe include. You might walk through a panel that talks about the applications, aerospace, civil engineering, all kinds of things that made computing real over a period of time. Or talk about maybe a German architect, Konrad Zuse. A group of folks and his son actually came to the museum with a lot of folks. We actually made him a museum fellow a couple of years ago. And how would you exhibit his particular materials? Well, today, all it looks like is a Zuse Z23 and a small part of a Zuse Z3 machine that he was an architect for and how it works. Our head curators and other folks can tell you all about the details of how those things worked and what its context was. But how would it be displayed in the long term, perhaps in an exhibit? Well, here's one example that you could talk about how Konrad Zuse was going to be. You could stand in front of this panel that could actually be embellished both the people and the stories of how these things might come together. Now, those of you that look closely on this will notice this thing called electromagnetic calculator on top. Of course, that's an error. But this is an iterative process that we've been going on for the past, better part of 6 months to a year now, and will probably continue to refine as we look for a timeline of history that's really going to be powerful and compelling that we'll put into place. Or for example, suppose you were to look about World War II. What was compelling about World War II from a calculation point of view, and what difference did it make, and how did we really approach it in a particular way? You could walk through that and see some of the context and the interpretation of its time. The Enigma machine, okay? A very significant machine, and also, by the way, there's a movie called The Enigma. If you haven't seen it, it is playing in the local area to get some context of all of that. But you can see this is on loan from Gordon Bell, one of his artifacts, and you can see that in our visible storage exhibit area, next to a part of ENIAC, which was a major reason why a very secret project that was done for calculations during the war, which later became things of significance. And how would you display that? Well, there's a lot of different ways to display it. I guess I lost something here. Apologize for that. Oops. Well, we can start from the beginning. There's a little bit of a problem, as you can tell. Well, you know, it's these darn computers. You're absolutely right. We actually were having some difficulties before. Okay, so where's mine? Okay, yeah, you can do fire performance. This is a story about the information age. How do you do this? And the fun part is it never ends. So why? Okay. Let's just walk through that a little again, if I could. So we were at the Enigma. You can look at how these kind of exhibits might be with a mini theater. There could be interactive videos that could describe some of the deep content of the photographs and the stories and some of the video clips that we have of the people. Some of you could actually be on video oral histories that we could bring up, that you could drill down to, that could be part of this exhibition process. There's a lot of different ways, and believe me, we debate this, and we argue, and we fight over it, and we try to come up with another rev, and then put that out for a lot of different kinds of comments. And we're getting to the stage where some of these are starting to take real shape, that it needs a home and needs a place to put it on, and then take a lot of that, and we're going to put that into a cyber museum. People make it happen in the museum. I've been saying that for the 2+ years that I've been here. This is our 1620 IBM 1620 restoration team to restore a computer over a better part of a year and a half, working on their own time on the weekends. A great team of people that got this machine working in its context. Now, how would you display that? Well, here's a possible example of what it might look like. And you see this gentleman sitting in front of a 1620 console, a big picture. You can walk up in front of it. This could be the working model of it. People could go by it and also view different pieces of it. What you probably don't know is that young gentleman that's sitting there, 40 years later, became our head curator. That actually was Mike Williams, our head curator, that is now working at our museum. A fantastic guy, a world-class computer historian, and someone who you can really appreciate as you go on some of his docent tours. Of course, let me bring it back to reality because I don't have much time and we're really here for Regis. But basically, we've got a great lecture program. Our next lecture, official lecture, begins in the fall with Al Shugart. We've got Chuck Geschke and John Warnock in November, Steve Wozniak in December, and of course in October is our famous month for our Fellows Awards dinner. And much of our literature, both on your seat as well as in the back, will give you all kinds of information about where we're going and how we're heading to the future. We've been getting some really good publicity recently. And of course, I would always welcome any comments from the marketing folks here tonight. And of course, I'd probably be crucified because no one seems to know about us. But the word is starting to spread. And I ask each of you to help us spread that word and do it in really a first-class way that we've been doing it. We're trying to do it up to date. And your help could be really valuable to us. But these are a few of the last ones we had. This was covering a lecture. That's a picture of the now Mike Williams, okay, that appeared in New Scientist magazine, and a couple of other great articles that appeared on ours recently. So let me finish my introduction of the museum. But I ask you to spread the word about us, okay? And volunteers, each and every one of you, can become a resource for us and for yourself to really get something more out of it than you can put into it. And we'd ask you to come help us volunteer, both your time, resources, artifacts in your basement, or particularly your stories and help. And of course, become a supporter tonight. And I'd like to just take a couple of moments to turn it over to one of our wonderful trustees, Donna Dubinsky, CEO of Handspring Corporation, who wanted to say a couple of things about her role and her view of what the museum is and where our future is. Donna?
Thanks, John. It's my job here tonight to ask you for your support. If you think it's important to collect computer history and to have an institution like the Computer History Museum, as I do, then it's really important that you support it as I do. And I think John just talked to you about the ways you can support it, but just to revisit them, definitely spread the word. A lot of people don't know we exist. Send them the lecture notices, take them to one of the open hours at the museum, bring them over and let them see what we're doing. Volunteer your time. Lots of volunteer opportunities. See a member of the staff if you're interested in doing that. And then finally, of course, most importantly is please give us your financial support as well. If you are a member, thank you very much for being a member. If you aren't, please join. Get all the information on what's going on at the museum. And if there's any way you can help us out beyond the membership, we're approaching the end of our fiscal year, and your help could really put us over the top. I just wanted to point out that in the core magazine that you have, there is a little brochure about membership and a very subtly included envelope. So hopefully that will give you some inspiration and join me in supporting this tremendous institution. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And let me conclude the first part just to introduce a couple of other trustees. Len Shustik, Chairman of the Board of Trustees. Bernard Poteau is here. Bernard, where's your hand? Back there. John Massey, Ike Nassi. Did I miss anyone else? Gordon Bell, of course, as many of you know. So thank you all. Those people you can corner if you have any additional questions about the museum. Well, the reason we're really here this evening is to spend an evening with Regis McKenna. Regis obviously has a new book that was out in the front. But he's Chairman Emeritus of the McKenna Group, a global strategy consulting firm specializing in application of information and telecommunications technologies. If you listen to what Regis has touched in companies, people, it's probably everybody in the Valley. He is included in the San Jose Mercury News Millennium 100 as one of the 100 people who made Silicon Valley what it is today. He's written and lectured extensively on social and marketing effects of technological change, advancing innovation in marketing theories and practice. And to give you an idea of that seems to be some of these startups of the old days, includes the formative years of America Online, Apple, Compaq, Electronic Arts, Intel, Linear Technology, Lotus, Microsoft, National Semiconductor, Silicon Graphics, 3Com, and many, many others, as well as many of the product launches that he'll probably tell you about this evening. And of course, computer history is a many-faceted process, and that's why we bring to you tonight kind of the marketing angle of this and someone that can look at it from a different angle, because we believe by looking at all history from all angles is where you get the real essence of what it's all about. And he's really pioneered many of the theories and practices of technology marketing that have become integrated into the marketing mainstream. To give you a idea of some of the things that he's involved with today, McKenna is chairman of the board of Santa Clara University Center for Science, Technology, and Society, was a founding member of Smart Valley. He is a trustee of Santa Clara University, the advisory board of the Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley, and the Economic Strategies Institute. He is president of the board of trustees for the Children's Shelter Fund of Silicon Valley, and he's also on an international advisory board of Toyota Motor Company. All in all, Regis, it sounds like you've been everywhere that it's anything in Silicon Valley. And let's give him a warm welcome for this night's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Emeritus means retired, and you all know what a retired person is, right? It's somebody who gets up in the morning with nothing to do and goes to bed with half of it done. This is the second time I've talked at the Computer Museum. The first time, where's Gordon? Gordon and Gwen invited me back, I think, one of the first or second or third speakers in Boston, way, way back. I think we talked about semiconductors all night. I'm a history buff, not necessarily a history of technology, but actually a history of our society, and history is a dialogue. Hegel called it a dialectic, and we're always talking to the past. And I fear, though, that in Silicon Valley, one of the things that we are missing is this dialogue with the past, and we saw it, I think, very much so in the past 10 years. That I asked an audience, I gave a talk 3 or 4 years ago, and to a group in San Jose. It was probably about 500, maybe 1,000 people, and I asked how many had been in Silicon Valley more than 10 years. And I think there was probably less than a third of the audience. So we have a lot of new people that have come into the Valley, And the old mechanisms, and particularly, I'll demonstrate some of this, or I'll show you some of this in a while, is really about not just reinvesting the money, it's reinvesting knowledge. You find that so many of the boards, so many of the venture people traditionally had operations experience. And you could think of somebody like John Young. John Young, I think, sits on 3 or 4 boards of startups, people like Don Valentine and so forth. Here are people that ran multi-billion-dollar companies, and you got a startup, and you could think about the relationships, the associations, and everything else that they are reinvesting back into these startups. And what happens is that when you have sort of the influx of a totally new people, it's like in any corporation, you lose your corporate memory, but you lose your community and social memory. You're unable to essentially, so over the last 10 years, I wager I could have made a lot of money doing nothing, not investing, but just helping people introduce people. Because everybody comes to you and says, yes, we could do a deal with this company, but we don't know anybody there. Where that wasn't true, I would say 10, 20 years ago, because everybody sort of came from the same community. And you could trace a company's history on the relationships themselves. I could get into that a little bit later with you if you'd like, and we could talk about it. But I just want to tell you that although there's a lot of predictions of Silicon Valley about the end being near, that's far from the case. Relationship marketing really gave way to a book I did called Real Time after that, and then Real Time became Total Access. And these are all related. They go back about 15 or 20 years now from the first book that I wrote, but they're all built on the same theme. And we all talk about marketing, but marketing in technology is really different. It really isn't the same as marketing out of Procter & Gamble. You know, when we go shopping in a grocery store, we don't have to worry about whether our milk is compatible with our cereal or whether we have to buy sugar. Oh my God, I got to buy Spreckles because it only goes with Cheerios. And, and by the way, could you introduce me to the president of Cheerios because, I really need to cut a deal with them because I have a lot of cows out there in the pasture and I need to. I mean, it's a whole different business. And yet, the infrastructure of the technology business is really based upon relationships. And I used to think that was actually the ideal way to do marketing, and not the way in which we think of it, which is to somehow or other broadcast to the world. And so most technology is really about building an infrastructure. It's about building the support. Even as I started exploring outside into the consumer businesses and started doing work with them, you find that every day someone in the world buys a Coca-Cola product, or 1/6 of the world. So there's 1 billion products bought every day by Coca-Cola. Now think about the distribution that has to be in place for that to happen. You could hire Tiger Woods and not be able to supply people in the Gobi Desert or in sub-Saharan Africa. So much so that in Venezuela, about 10 years ago, Pepsi owned the franchise. It was a closed economy at the time. When that opened up, Coke went in, bought out the distributors, and the next day you couldn't buy a Pepsi, so market share shifted. And so it happens in that business, but few people realize that Intel owned 85% of the market before they ran their first Intel Inside ad. And so, from a technology standpoint, standards and establishing yourself. So while we all love Apple, we think it has a great logo and it has a great identification, it owns less than 4% of the market. And so it doesn't have the economies of scale that you can do by building on standards. You can say, well, they're not, they're much more creative, but it creates the problem of having the standards. It's like not being able to drive on the same roads and not having the same cars. So marketing is really has 2 different aspects to it. And that's what this is all about. It's about changing that whole consumer realm to much more people-to-people marketing. And I tell a story about, I'm going to get way off here, so you just bear with me. I may not get through 4 of these slides. This happened a long time ago. I kept saying it was 20 years ago, and then I found out it was 30 years ago. It was probably 35 years ago. We had lived in California. We didn't have a TV set. My wife and I were married about 10 years, and I bought an RCA color television. It was a great big thing. It was beautiful, and after I think the second day it broke. And so I I called them and they said, the store, bought it at one of the department stores, and they said, no, you have to take it to our repair center down in San Jose. And so I did. And it looked like a place that wasn't where it was going to be repaired well. And you had to carry it in the back of your wagon. You had to do all the work, take it in, leave it there. Well, they told me to come back in a week, gave me a ticket or something, and I went back in a week, and the place was closed. And it said, closed for inventory. So I went back in another week, and I called them, and they said, we have to order parts, and the parts aren't going to be in for another month. So this went on and on and on. I mean, I was really disturbed, and I couldn't get my TV back. And so I decided to call the president of RCA. And I somehow or other tracked him down. I went to the library, or I just started on information, and I found out. I went to one place, and they sent me to another. And it ends up, and I finally got to him, and I learned his name. I don't remember it this time, but let's say his name was John Doe. And so when his secretary answered the phone, I very casually said, "Hi, is Jack there?" Now, she thought I was, his golfing buddy probably or something, So she says, "Just a moment," put me right through. So, and for 5 minutes, I just let him have it about the difference between what I had heard in their ads and on the radio and what I had seen in the newspapers and what the reality was. And there was a long silence. And he said, "How the hell did you get through?" Now, imagine doing that today. I mean, we now have interactive media. You talk to the consumer, and everybody in companies today will say that, you have to allow people to talk to you. So we have technology now that answers back. We have technology so much so today that we can deal with individuals the same way that we can deal in the business-to-business world. It's called CRM, Customer Relationship Management. If I told you 10 or 15 years ago that we were going to manage our customers with software and computers, and that probably more than 50 or 60 or even 75% of all marketing will be done machine to machine or people to machine, you would say that's nonsense. We need to have personal relationships. Well, try to stand in line at a post office. And be the 20th person. They're going to spend, they lost $1.7 billion last year, and they're going to spend money on a national advertising campaign to get you to come back. They're not going to spend that much money on automation so that you can automate the services, but they will spend it to try to change your mind to get you to come in to have a bad experience. So underneath all of this, over the years, you have to, the changes in the technology have changed us. The remote control changed us more than I changed it. We complain about having, 90 channels of television. We've now gone to 200. And we sit there, and I do go through them all. I've never even watched a commercial since I picked up a remote control, and my wife and I fight over it. No, I can go faster through them than you can. How many channels are there on the internet? How many servers can we access, Gordon? 80, 90 million? So there's 80, 90 million channels on the internet. But what do you have? You have a browser. The browser manages that for you. Just like the telephone, it has 9 buttons, or 12 buttons rather. Mine only has 9. It has 12 buttons. And, I always say my wife's phone number is 5. That's a speed dial, right? My wife says, "Who's 1, 2, 3, and 4?" And I say, jeweler, candy store. But, these are all shortcuts for us to interface with the world. And so these shortcuts for us to interface with the world change our behavior. It changes us far more than a $200 million ad campaign, because we encounter in our daily experience and we don't even think about it. Starbucks really took this philosophy. Starbucks didn't run an ad either. They basically just started showing up on every corner. So much so that pretty soon we're going to have a Starbucks opening up inside another Starbucks. So all of these things are related, and it's the technology underneath. Most people don't realize that. I've listened to marketing lectures by somebody saying, we got a great nationwide commercial here that we're going to do, and it come on, and nobody understood the commercial. And they said, "Regis, this is exactly up your alley." That's not what I ever really preached. Most of what we did was below the surface. I used to have these slides that showed icebergs and would say, what is this below the surface? Then that gives you the ability to do what's visible. You can only reflect on what is real. You can't reflect on hypothetical kinds of things, because sooner or later, perception does catch up with reality, or reality with perception. And so these gaps close. And marketing anymore is going to become much more not only real time, but you are going to be the marketer. You're going to be marketing to the producer rather than the producer marketing you. And already that's in process because of the feedback mechanism and because of the fact that we have these communities of interest that do use the internet to transmit information and communicate. Well, the Valley, I think, has been very instrumental in that. And I already blew my slide here, but I was going to ask you to identify the years whenever these headlines occurred. But I know we're all sitting here in the midst of depression, and most of the things, and I'll call it a depression rather than a recession, but it's because I'm depressed. But in 1991, LA Times wrote, "Dreams of Silicon Valley striking it rich or fading." How about this headline? "Silicon Valley is losing its edge." Anybody want to guess? That was 1985. How about Computer World? "Study reveals Silicon Valley declining or losing its appeal." By the way, the last two here were about the fact that the crowded highways, the cost of housing, all of the kinds of things that we're still struggling with. It was in 1983. And of course, Business Week did one, "Why Success is Choking Silicon Valley," and that again covered the same sort of topics, and that was 1980. And I just didn't have time to go back and dig out the ones in the 70s and 60s, but I have those as well. And again, I think somehow or other everybody thought it was a party. Every company I've ever worked with, you go there, the people are sleeping on the floors at night, but somehow or other the media thinks that we're having a party here. It says the party's over, companies drunk on success, get gut-wrenching wake-up call. This was the Mercury News in April. The party's definitely over for Silicon Valley. They said that in November of 2001, and then, of course, in 1985, they said it was fun while it lasted, but the party's over in Silicon Valley. So I suppose there's not, we're sitting here, we're all looking back at history, because history in itself, we're now able to sit back and say, weren't the good old days good, great, and it was wonderful, but we all weren't there. That's over with now, and it's all going to happen somewhere else. I don't think so. The laws that are driving Silicon Valley are still very much alive and well. And what we think about Moore's law, the doubling of devices on a chip of silicon every 18 months, and the resulting economics of that, the economics of declining costs of computing, are only really beginning to be felt in our society. And what that really is not about technology, it's about economics and social change. And an example of this is, you all have just destroyed some of my jokes tonight, because I used to look at an audience and say, this is a transistor, circa 1962. And I would say, how many of you were born after 1962? And usually the whole audience raised their hand. I could see here that some of you probably somebody designed them. But this came from a company called General Microelectronics. It was the first semiconductor company that I was with back in 1963. And we made about a penny or two on these things selling them to the government, but we made 5 cents selling them to a Hong Kong toy maker. Then they were called, on the order line, it was called Bunny Eyes, because they used to put them in stuffed toys. And this was before the safety and all the sorts of things, because you could pull them out very easy, but they would just actually sell them into stuffed toys. This is a Xilinx chip. It's 250 million transistors. So my sort of career spanned these two types of activities. Now this is, of course, remotely programmable. It allows, and what it really creates is services. And when you get the cost of devices down at that level, you begin to find that these are free. And why are they free? And what do you pay for here? Do you pay for the hardware? No, you pay for the service that comes through the hardware. And this is I have a lot of these stuff. This is a glucose monitor. So I'm a diabetic. That's a glucose monitor. It's a pen. And you can connect these things today to the internet. You can download the information. It stores 250 glucose tests. You can test your blood in 15 seconds, or actually 5 seconds. Download the 250 different tests to your doctor. You can chart it on your computer. You can track how you're doing as a diabetic. Now, those kinds of things that are turning devices into services is changing our society because 85% of our jobs today are service-related. And it really has to do with about 25 years of investment in IT and in basic technologies, which has created CAE, computer-aided everything. And as a result, it's transitioned us to where we don't make things anymore. It was really interesting to see IBM in the last week get out of the disk drive business, but stay in probably the service business, which is integrating those businesses. In fact, the fastest growing business in the computer industry today is the integration business. It's putting all of this stuff together as services. And another interesting story about that, I mean, there's a couple interesting stories with this. One is a company that is in Schaumburg and in other parts of the United States, had a phone. In fact, I think I have one here, yes. I don't use it anymore. It cost me $2,500. And I had a meeting with them and told them they were trying to keep their $2,500 price differential by emulating Tide. And in fact, they hired some people and had some people come in from Procter & Gamble to try to explain to them what the difference was between their brands and other brands. And the difference was that they positioned themselves as a brand, and brands created pricing differential. Well, you know, anybody want this? I haven't used it for a long time. This one I got at Akihabara for $1. And in fact, I bought 5 of them. And the reason I bought 5 of them, well, I'll tell you the story. I actually bought 5 of them. The next day I was going to visit the president of Docomo. So I walked in and we were sitting there, you know, in the Japanese, they have the very formal rooms, and I took this thing and I pushed it across the desk and I said, you know, I know how you can make a lot more money with that. And his eyes lit up. He said, how? I said, make toys of them. Sell those as toys. You know, I'm bringing 5 back for my 5 grandkids. Did you ever go out and try to buy a toy phone for your kids? I mean, or for your grandkids? $25, $50 some of them cost. This is $1, and they got a real one. You put a battery in this thing, it lights up. They all have these. They all have these. And so they said, wow, that's great, you know. So you could actually make a good money. I don't think he quite got what I was saying. But in fact, it's really interesting because the toys, you know, this is a watch. This is a Microma watch. And the reason Intel went into the watch business is because they wanted a driver for the chips, right? They wanted applications. So there's lots of experimentation that goes on in the Valley to create markets for things that essentially suck, if you will, the technology out of the silicon into services and applications. And a lot of the ways we can look at the dot-coms as a complete failure, but we can also look at them as social experimentation. Who else would do that? What other country would experiment with this kind of interaction? What other company would invest the money? And so we're blamed for experimentation, but we would say, gee, you know, you've got to invest in R&D. We just don't invest in R&D for the society. And yet society changes on the same kinds of trial and error basis that we do with technologies. We're never sure of it. There's a lot of failures in Silicon Valley. And in fact, I remember once seeing a study that about only 1/3 of the companies in Silicon Valley succeed. And I was telling Bob Noyce about it, and he said, maybe not enough fail. And I was really kind of shocked with it. This was quite a few years ago. In fact, it was Al Bruno at Santa Clara University who did this study, I think it was about 20 years ago. Probably was 25, but it was 20 years ago, I think, on the categories of companies in Silicon Valley. And he said, and Noyce said, well, maybe not enough fail. And I said, what do you mean? He says, when you fail, it means you're trying new things. And you're bound to fail because you don't know what's on the other side. So you experiment. Well, we accept this in certain parts of our society, we don't in others. And why is that? Well, one of the things that happens in the new marketing world is that you are all experimenters. You all are part of the R&D environment. And you are now. How many of you use software? How many of you use new releases of software? You're all beta sites. Yeah, and that's true, by the way. There was a study done at Stanford that on the difference between American software industry and Japanese software industry. And the difference is that Americans will put as much functionality into a piece of software and put it out as cheap as they can and let the marketplace decide where it goes. In the Japanese model, they would take 5 years or 6 years to develop the perfect piece of software with no bugs, And by the time they got it out, they were 3 to 4 years late. And so the marketplace is actually part of the process, and has been for some years, of exchange with businesses. And the feedback mechanisms today are growing for us to actually take products and feed them back into the system and change them and alter them. We do it all the time. So Bob Metcalf came along and said, well, he actually didn't say it, Gilder said it. He's the one who came up with Metcalfe's law, which was that the internet's value is in the square of value is in the square of the number of users. And he uses this term of one Xerox machine is of no value. But you could think about it being even leveraged much more than that. It's really sort of the square of n, because the fact of the matter is we have about 1 billion cell phones now in the world, all of which could quite capably be join the internet. We have about 1 billion computers. We're selling about 100 to 150 million computers a year. 40% of the cell phones sold in the last 2 years went to third world countries. And you can begin to look at, and maybe another 1 billion devices out there that are connectable. So over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have somewhere between 3 and maybe 4 billion people who have access to communication networks. And if you think about the impact of that and the rise of this whole concept of 6 degrees of separation, you begin to think about how that degrees of separation can link us to many other people and social issues and problems of the world. So while we have this wonderful technology that we've been touting and praising for the last 10, 15 years, we also have the opportunity, or people who do not see our values and our systems and our social history the way they do, their history is different. So in effect, histories, or the dialogues of histories, clash. And we see this between Eastern and Western values. We see it between Middle Eastern and Western values. And it's not really values, it's really history. And it collides. And so this next decade and this next quarter century is going to be one in which we're doing an awful lot of social experiment, all as a result of driving forces of technology. And this isn't new, by the way. The Industrial Revolution drove exactly the same thing. If you think that was a human world, think about what the Industrial Revolution created over the last 100 years of the last century. Because while John talked about World War II, I'm a World War I buff. And actually, someone recently told me that when Berlin Wall came down, World War I ended. And you can trace almost much of what happened today back, including the technologies, back over 100 years. And so the impact of this connected world actually influences the way in which we shape our government, shape our institutions, shape the way we think, shape the way we see each other. And that has been yet to be determined. We're still very much caught up in sort of the short-range view of how things happen and where they are. And Silicon Valley didn't happen overnight. It happened over long periods of time, and each technology learned from this previous, but they're still there, and we're still learning from it. And Donna was asking me about we were talking about this beforehand, and I was pointing out that how much of the venture capital and how much of the Valley's applications, the personal computer and others, came out of the semiconductor industry, largely because semiconductor, it wasn't that the semiconductor companies saw it, but semiconductor companies, if you worked in them, you went out, and I met Henry Ford when I was at General Microelectronics. We introduced the first MOS devices to him. And we made a platform to show him how MOS technology could be effective in the automobile industry. And we designed a little platform, had little toy cars, and we were sort of a demonstration, see. So we went back and showed it to him, and because GME was bought by Philco, and Philco was owned by Ford. So they wanted to see if this could apply into the automobile world. This was in 1965. And they had a press conference about this little company out in Silicon Valley. It was a big deal. And Henry Ford was asked about, well, what's the applications of these things going to be? Well, how's it going to end? He said, well, somebody had mentioned to him that you could automate traffic lights. And Phil Ferguson, who was the president, had been at TI, as in the research department, had been at Fairchild. He was the president. And so they turned to him and they said, well, what would happen then? He says, well, every car in America would have to turn right at the same time. But and he said that in front of Henry Ford. That did not turn out to be a great investment for Henry, or his son, rather. But then, I'm not talking about Henry Ford Sr., right? Gordon knows him, but I don't. So, you know, when you start tracing how these various technologies interact with people, and then how it changes them, and how much they lose, and then what they learn from that. I mean, in effect, it brought down Philco, because when they bought GME, they were pouring $1 million, something like a month, into that company to try to bring it around because it was so visible. And the Fickus, who was the president at the time, was actually kicked out because of this. It created a whole collapse of investment in that company. And as a result, it started going downhill from there in terms of the semiconductors. It was also an East Coast, West Coast battle, who controls the infrastructure and so forth. So all of those things were people-related more so than they were technology-related, even though the technology became the battleground. And each of these have those stories, and each of them evolve. A company called Caliper, which I am on the board of, an early investor, this is a fluidics chip. And it's a microprocessor. You put in, if you will, fluidic information, just as you do raw material into a processor, and the output is digital. So it can do, remember O.J. Simpson, it took 3 weeks to get his DNA, and then everybody debated over it? You do this in 5 seconds, and they can do hundreds of thousands of these a day. And guess where this company started? On Fairchild Drive. They're in the same location as the old original Fairchild building down there. And if you go in there, what you'll see, the chemists are not pouring stuff into test tubes and Petri dishes. They sit at computers, and they put little cards into a computer that are filled with different types of biological material, and they sit there and they analyze it through computers. You could walk into a software company or into this company, which is a chemical company, if you will, and you'll find exactly, you wouldn't know where you were. And that's what's coming on right now. And this whole right-hand there with the S is a different category, isn't it? But, but all of these and I have 2005, all of those are information-based. Because what you produce out of here is database. And the companies that are making money off of this now are the companies that are building databases and then selling the information or the connectivity to that database. Now, so each of these are now, as we move, and particularly the nanotechnology, we're moving to where more and more of what information is the heart of everything that we do. And each of these companies, I was involved with some way or another with every one of these companies, and I know I put this one on just before I came. It's called Umba. I don't even remember if that's the right way you spell it, but it was called Umba. They were a competitor of Apple. And Albert Yu, some of you may know Albert Yu. He was actually one of the original guys back at Intel. Was the founder. It was funded by Chinese money, and it was a cartridge-based PC. And one of the things that happened was that we gave them up. We were doing work with them before Apple, and we made a decision to go with Apple instead of Umba. And it was a big debate at the time. And, but, you know, these kinds of companies, you know, there are hundreds, even thousands of these that have come along that have made some kind of contribution in one way or another to bring technology and people's experience forward. And that's what they used to say. There wasn't you didn't have to fail in Silicon Valley and lose your job. I mean, you could go on and put that experience to work in the next new generation. So many of these kinds of businesses that sit on top of the other are people who have failed in one thing, but then bring it to another experience or to another level. And one of the reasons that I was associated with all these is because the people were the same. The people moved on. The people become the relationships, and they're the connectivity. Well, we've now created this deluge of information. I mean, this is a study that was done over at Berkeley. There's enough stored information in the world today for 250 megabytes for every man, woman, and child on Earth. And what are we going to do with all of that? Or do we use it all? Do we use it productively? Do we use this? Do we use it to apply it to things? Do we use it to? I mean, are we any smarter as people? How do we access this? What have we done with interfaces? How do we allow people to make decisions? You know, I was talking to Gordon about the idea of walking through an airport unimpeded, and you have people searching you. You don't feel as though you're free anymore. And so we have these trade-offs between privacy and security and information that probably could be hidden from view and make all of us very secure if we somehow or other were able to have the technology allow us to simply walk through an airport and we felt secure because everything was already checked. Our social security number, our passports, all of those databases, all of this information can be cross-checked, but it's an enormous job, more so than perhaps going than the 10 years to go to the moon. But in fact, it is a Manhattan Project for the future. To be able to use information to create a much more free society. Some of these are, there's memory. I always say memory's free, and people in the memory business don't like that, but you can't take these curves down much more. And in fact, I had a gigabyte on a very small disk drive that IBM gave me, and I lost it. I lost the transistor. In fact, I lost the transistor. I used to bring these were being made in Silicon Valley whenever I tell McCullough, and then I have this. This is the first LED display. And each segment was gallium arsenide put together by hand. So when you think of a segment being lit up and put together by hand, you know, that we've come a long way. And then I got a bunch of chips in there. But I keep losing these things because I put them in my bag and then they drop out. But this is why, for the past 60 years, the percentage of American business, this percentage spent on information technology in whether it's design or production or logistics systems or automating tools has grown rather substantially because it parallels, if you will, the decline in price of Moore's Law and the price of storage, and actually communication costs are going just as fast. Actually, the storage costs have to go down faster, if you will, than even Moore's Law. Because if they don't, everything would implode. You've got to have a place to put all this stuff. So we actually have to make the storage cheaper and more accessible, and the technology in various industries that surround the microprocessor that make it useful actually have to move faster than Moore's Law. And there's a Moore's Law for everything. As I was told, the Moore's Law battery is every 9 years. So technologies move at different paces, and as they come up to a surface where you can interchange the information from each of these technologies, they're put to use, and they create sort of an application layer that bubbles up. You could not do one-to-one marketing without programmability. You couldn't have any kind of mass customization. We couldn't do anything today in terms of what we think of in marketing without programmability. We couldn't do logistics systems. We couldn't order books. We couldn't customize the interfaces to individuals. You couldn't have your telephone database yourself without programmability. And that comes down to basically the cost and the application of IT. I told you I'm a diabetic, and this is an insulin pump. If I'm taking the right thing off here, I may be destroying my microphone system here. It's just a simple device, but it is a diabetic device, or an artificial pancreas, if you will. And the guy who invented this was Kamen. Is it Adam? Adam? Damon. Dean Kamen. And he did it, again, probably 30 years ago. And when it first came out, and I'm a junkie, so I think the first one was about this big, and it went down. It was originally developed, his brother was a physician at Princeton, and asked him to develop for chemotherapy. So it used to have 4 or 5 different syringes in it, and was trying to deliver, if you will, the drip method, drugs for chemotherapy. And somebody saw that and wrote an article on the possible uses for diabetes, and it ended up being the most practical and today the most used version of it. I don't even think it's used in chemotherapy. But the interesting thing is that when I started tracking him down whenever I first got my first one, and that's how I've known him for about 25 years or more, And I said, what's in there? Why did you do this? How did you invent it? And he says, I really didn't invent anything. I just assembled all the available technologies. For example, the tubing. You could not do this without advancements in tubing, right? I mean, because it can't crimp. It can't shut off the flow. Miniature motors. All of the types of technologies he went through, he listed about 20 technologies that had to come together, low-power devices, because it's got to be battery-driven. In other words, you can't pull around a cart with you. So what entrepreneurship is all about is the ability to see different technologies and assemble them. It's in effect what Steve Jobs did. You know, he didn't invent any of those things, and neither did Steve Case. And basically, they assembled the technologies that they saw around them, and they were able to then pull that together into a whole and get people to essentially develop the markets for them in relationships with others. I'll go through one last thing, and then we can. I'm far behind in my slides, so I just want to tell you a few things here about how the structure of the industry. And this is particularly true in America, and it is that we tend to think of the startups here in Silicon Valley as inventors rather than entrepreneurs. And I always defined entrepreneurs as sort of honorable thieves. They, like Dean came and they sort of take all these things and from other people's ideas and put them together. Well, basic research, which is largely done in the United States through universities or public and private labs, and increasingly, of course, it's been moving into places like IBM and Intel and other places, and probably Microsoft as well. But by and large, it's funded through our tax dollars, AIDS research, for example. And a lot of the cancer research is government funded. It's initiated at universities, and you create a pool of knowledge. Applied research is done by big companies. And it's all the various, IBM, Almaden Labs, HP Labs, Xerox PARC, Intel, and various, because it's expensive. It takes a lot of money, a lot of equipment. An electron microscope is, I guess, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 to $1 million today. You get very expensive types of equipment. You have to really spend a lot of time failing a lot, which you cannot afford in the capitalistic environment. You just can't. You have to please Wall Street, so you have to move this stuff forward. So you have to have some large amounts of investment to put into applied research. Development is done by everybody, but in fact, there's been a lot of studies over the years that show that something like 60 to 80% of all the product developments in the United States have come from companies under 5 years of age with less than 200 employees. And one of the reasons is because they can focus. Gordon Moore once said, we have more technology than we have time nor money to bring to market. So companies have to set priorities, and there's always projects that while they're focused on their customer and their legacy, that's what they see, and so therefore there's all of these other kinds of things that someone else has the opportunity to spin off, take, and develop the technology for, or develop the market for. So that is where Silicon Valley resides. It's in that middle. 90% of the companies do D. They don't do R. 99% of them probably. Very few companies do research, even though we report it on the R&D. They really do D. And oftentimes, the D comes first, and then you go back to find what's going on. So because you hit a wall. This happens certainly with Moore's Law. And the semiconductor, Stanford didn't start its microelectronics lab until the mid-'80s. The semiconductor business started in 1948 with the invention of the transistor. And not only that, but it wasn't until 1985 that the semiconductor industry as a whole became profitable. So while it started in 1948 or 50, say 50, when the market was starting to develop in the early 50s, it took 20 to 30 years for the industry to essentially find an infrastructure for success. And it's unlikely we'll see nanotechnology that is just now emerging here, and everybody's talking about the next wave is going to be all of these. It's highly unlikely that I will ever see the infrastructure for nanotechnology be a huge multi-billion-dollar marketplace. Simply because even today, most of Silicon Valley, if you look at the 150 top companies, they are production, marketing, and distribution companies, and most of the big ones are somehow or other related to semiconductors and semiconductor businesses, Applied Materials and Intel and Cisco, and all of these companies are big, big companies that either design or make or rely upon new chips and new technology to create it. And the production and marketing is big companies. It's where Japan largely invested heavily by buying R&D over the 70s and 80s and developing production models and investing, in quality and so forth. And this new category that is added, which is services. I would claim that Dow is not a technology company, and neither is Amazon.com. Most of these companies are service companies. Dell spends less than 2% on R&D. That's not what you would call a technology company. Their technology is in logistics, but they're not certainly the kind of company that has to keep developing operating systems and software, and they don't have, rooms full of engineers that are really, and scientists developing new ways of computing. This whole process is funded through different mechanisms. I said government, big companies, applied research, development is done by venture capital. The production, marketing, and service sectors are huge global infrastructures that require lots and lots of resources and services and capital, and that's funded by public markets. And that is why the public market in NASDAQ was so important to the high-tech industry, because you could not, to build an infrastructure usually takes 10 to 20 years. It's not what we think. It doesn't take 3 years. AOL is just finding out that by acquiring somebody else's assets, they doesn't mean you can manage it and you understand an infrastructure and that you have the ability to grow continuously in all of these aspects. There's a great vision of those things, but probably the problems they will have will be felt for the next 10 or even 15 years, and they will start selling off assets in order to fund the infrastructure. So all of this is important, but funding it is essential. And that's why we're all concerned about this current recession. It's a recession not of technology. Moore's laws continue to advance. The internet will grow and probably double again in the next year to two in terms of size. Devices will be cheaper. New technology is advancing. It's our ability to build businesses of value that don't have exit strategies at their business plan, but have growth and long-term infrastructure as part of their long-term heritage. And that requires huge investments, and we need the marketplace to come back, because there's only 3 ways to fund it. That's through equity, debt, or loans, and or profits. And it takes a long time to develop profits in new industries. And if the equity market is gone, we could borrow money, but that's what Japan did. And that's why Japan is in trouble. So we need one of those 3 things to come back. And the shortest term way to develop new technology of the future is for all of us to have faith in the future, and I think that's what the equity market was traditionally. So loss of confidence, loss of faith could truly slow down Silicon Valley. Not the technology, but the loss of faith in the technology. At that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. We have some questions here.
Could you say that both companies require that missing R, and that perhaps that companies without that R are just simply mature companies, and maybe the whole point of the focus in the stock market, any R is just negative EPS, and so after a while, you phase out this, and that's how we got ourselves in this predicament in the first place.
I think that's part of it. I think it's the other thing that has happened is that this is a model that is fairly dynamic, and that it's very unique in that there's the relationships that exist between all of these various entities. They're not a formal relationship. They're not structured in the sense that I've spent a lot of years in Japan and other countries working with governments on these issues, and one of the things is they try to structure this. And I try to explain that it really is relationships. You look at the Valley here and the spin-outs from the universities. They were at MIT. At one point, there were more MIT presidents in Silicon Valley than there were Stanford, of high-tech companies than Stanford. So the relationships in technology really spread across all of these. And if you want to create a deal with someone, first thing you do is say, who do you know at this company, so we can sit down, or you can bring somebody in and show them. This caliper, I brought Lou Platt into that, and Agilent ended up doing a $100 million deal with them as a result of Lou coming in and saying, I understand what they're doing. You got to talk to these people. So you create that relationship, then it goes down and it's able to, and this is the same thing that happened in microprocessors with Intel and Microsoft and so forth. These were all early relationships that were established, and they understood each other's technologies and how to work together. Universities, I think, are where the natural development and sort of the free spirit attitude exists. Certain labs have been able to develop that, but the economics of the marketplace are not going to allow us to do that. I think that whole dialogue between basic research and applied research has changed over many years, where universities also are moving more toward applied research simply because that's where the money is. And you don't get funded a great deal because we live in this short-time world. So basic research has declined as a percentage of overall research in the United States. Applied research has actually grown because it's closer to development. And you can see a lot of the things in most of the well-known companies' labs have put hold on applied research that isn't short-term. So I think that is a serious issue, and I don't think Wall Street makes decisions based upon the long-term interests of their patriotic interests. I think they make them based largely upon short-term needs of their company and of their investors.
I want to ask if wanted to ask if the emergence of a major new brand is like uncovering the mythology of the brand in the Joseph Campbell sense of the word. I was intrigued in the book Fire in the Valley and the description that perhaps you and Mike Markula and Steve Jobs kind of developed a major mythology or brand early on, and then they tried to make the company match the mythology that they had been bold enough to describe. Nobody thinks now that it was unusual to call a hardware company after a fruit, which was kind of unusual at the time. And if you can just comment also about where you see opportunities for new brand or mythology emerging in the nanotech space these days.
I'll plug my book a little bit because I addressed that issue in here because I spent really the last 3 years looking at brands other than the ones that I've been directly associated with here, and all brands emerged. The brands came after. Somewhere here I got a slide that says, brands after the fact. Starbucks, for example, is a current one that we didn't know about until it showed up, and that is their plan. And in fact, Howard Schultz will tell you that he thinks people don't get a return on this sort of branding through advertising. You got to create the experience with people. And the Apple one is a very interesting one because, and again, the dynamics have changed over time because Apple started in 1977, and or its branding, if you will, started. It was, I think, 1976 when I first met the two Steves, but in 1977, the ability to identify a company at all here in Silicon Valley was very difficult. Wall Street Journal would not publish articles on a company that was not listed on the New York Stock Exchange. They wouldn't write articles on it until 1983. Most people don't know that. And in fact, Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, and others would buy, well, not so much Business Week, but a lot of the big journals would send back envelopes from Intel or any of these companies saying, we're not interested. I sat with an analyst in their cafeteria at, I won't say, he's still around. And I was trying to talk to him about Intel one time, and he said, look, we're not interested in any of those little companies out there. In fact, he said, the only company worth us following is IBM. And I have a newsletter that I used to put out in 1978. I should have brought it along. That I read from an analyst report that says that if new companies, if new ideas come along, it's more than likely going to be from the divisions of large companies, because the only large companies have the resources to develop markets. So, you know, there was a different attitude in those days. So one of the things with Apple was I did some work for Memorex, and Memorex was sort of a miniature version of IBM. They tried to imitate them. Everything was black and white, very clean design. They went out and got designers that were, and so the idea was, well, let's just shock the computer world a little, and let's put, and I actually just went around, I mean, on surveys where I asked people, who's the president of IBM? Nobody knew. So by having, you know, Steve, who was very articulate even as a young man, he differentiated this group, and you really had to do that then, because you would not have been able to go public. You would not, and certainly key people like Ben Rosen helped a lot. I mean, he was a renegade even back in the early days, so he started holding these conferences and bringing visibility. He's the one that raised the visibility of Morgan Stanley that took them public. So it was individual, it was leadership, it was doing a lot of you know, going in and demonstration. We put on every technology I've been involved with. The first MOS, we used to make more money selling seminars on MOS technology than we did on the chips. We made more, you know, at Intel. Intel once held more seminars and workshops than De Anza had in their quarterly schedule of classes, because you had to teach people what this was all about. There wasn't an analogy. There wasn't oh, this is like this, okay, or this is something like, in fact, the first microprocessors were called microcomputers, and the first microcomputers were called microprocessors. And people used to argue over, is it hyphenated or not hyphenated, and all those kind of things. You know, is it a microprocessor or is it a micro? You know, and all of those kinds of issues were new, and so at that time, education, to my mind, was what changed their mind, and that's why we spent so much time in the 70s and the 80s going to New York City. I literally was going to buy a home there just because I was there at least 1 week to 2 weeks a month. And, you know, you didn't pay me to do it. I just went and did it because we had to. And no one would pay attention. There weren't bureaus. The only people that were writing about this stuff were the science editors. And so go in and talk to the science editor at Time Magazine or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, and, you know, they were interested in the pharmaceutical industry, or I mean, it was very strange stuff. And Gene Belinsky and a guy named before him, Walter McElhenney, was one of the very early guys to start writing about this place and these technologies. And that helped educate. They were really people who came out and understood what was happening. Today, you know, people don't understand the relationships. They don't. It's very hard today because people get thrown into all kinds of jobs, whether it's here in the Valley or into journalism or into writing books, that are looking at it from a perspective of their history, and not from the perspective of the history of the people who did it. We were talking again about beforehand, where I was asked to write a review for a book on Intel for the Financial Times a couple years ago. And when I did some research on it, the fellow who did it came out here. He rented an apartment for 6 weeks, brought his staff in. He went around and interviewed everybody. And of course, the only people that wanted to talk about what really went on at Intel were the people that had an axe to grind. And you know, to ask people, I mean, I would never accept an interview on any book on Steve Jobs or Apple. And so and read some of those. And I mean, I've been described as somebody with flaming red hair, you know, and things like that, you know. And even once I didn't have that, you know, a long time ago, even back in history. So anyway.
It seems that some of the most successful companies, such as Dell and eBay, are successful because they're distribution and marketing companies. And my question is, do you believe that's the model needed for companies to have a long-term sustainable competitive advantage?
Again, it depends on what you call marketing. I think that building a standard is marketing. I think the American automobile industry thought that building a good car wasn't good marketing, but convincing you to drive a car was a good marketing. The Japanese thought building a good car was marketing. And so they built better cars and we switched. And so one of the things that happened in the model that I think we're switching to is that marketing is going to follow quality. Quality, we found out, was everybody's job. It wasn't a function in an organization. And to be effective, they put in a quality control, and then they changed it. We started having, trying to improve quality. What we found out in quality was you had to work with your customers very closely. You had to know what your customers were doing, and you had to work together. So you found out that everybody from the chairman of the board down to the shipping clerk had to be involved in quality control, total quality management. All of those kinds of things had to come together. Well, if you design a bad product, I don't care what you do, you are not going to market it. And if you don't manufacture it well, if it isn't high quality. So the problem is that we segment marketing into this box and say, here's what it is. I'm always fighting this because everybody's always saying, Regis, well, you're a marketer, so here, help me pick out a color. I'm colorblind. I would sit in meetings and talk with people, and there's the marketing guy saying, we need a good slogan, and I'm saying, what's your distribution? And people don't sort of get it that you got to build that infrastructure, and then it almost doesn't matter what your name is. Apple's a fruit. But IBM, what is that? It used to be International Business Machines. It used to be something else. If you're successful, it doesn't matter. In Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye sings a song, If I Were a Rich Man. He says, if I were a rich man, I'd sit in the temple and I'd lecture to the wise men, and it wouldn't matter if I'm right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you know. And so, Bill Gates, all these people, they're called to give an opinion on education or, the environment or whatever. Because, quite honest, they're rich, right? We make those kinds of judgments simply because, well, they must know something. Because the guys who are going out of business or don't have as big a market share, aren't successful, they don't know something that these people know. And so the most important marketing tool you have is good financials. I told that to Bill Campbell, and back at the Apple Day, I told to John Scully, I said, you have to get these things, and he went into it. He'll tell you all right now. The big first thing he did at Apple is he'd tell them, we've got to make money, because if we don't make money, we'll have no ability to market to other people. And you watch what's happened at HP and Compaq. The first thing that happened was Michael Dell comes out and says at his financial analyst meeting, we're taking business away from them because people are concerned about their future. And in this business, when you're concerned about, are you investing? Are you developing new products? Are you going to provide the support? If you can't demonstrate that to the public and to your customers, your competitor will take business away from you.
Back a little bit to the thing you alluded to before about the basic research. Let me tell you the concern a lot of us have is I would observe an awful lot of the computer and communications business sits on top of basic research done at Bell Labs, IBM Research, or right here when it was Xerox PARC.
That's true.
Okay, and well, this isn't Xerox PARC anymore. IBM just sold off the disk stuff, and Bell Labs isn't what it used to be. What do you see for those 2005 companies? Who's doing the basic research for that? And what do you think we need to do to replace the sort of the era of the really big, powerful industrial R&D labs?
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, Dave Packard once said that if it were not for Bell Labs, HP would be a shadow of itself. That's true of probably most companies we know that are successful today. And I think that is a serious problem because we've got to figure out a new way. And I think that one of the things that we will do is develop certainly some new centers of excellence. I think Gordon can attest to this, but I think Microsoft is certainly, quite frankly, I mean, this is valuable. People don't want to talk about Microsoft so much, but I think Microsoft is becoming a very big research entity in software and development of new ways of thinking. I think we're also seeing sort of the reawakening of universities in this area. Around the country now, particularly around the world for that matter, particularly with networks, the ability to share information. We saw this happen with the genome and how sharing of information and communicating. So maybe the laboratory, the R&D lab, or particularly the R lab, is not going to be a fixed place anymore, that it's going to be much more in the network. I was really serious about this, this model of the Industrial Revolution creating this organizational chart and this institutional way of thinking where we divided labor into boxes. And we did it in education. We essentially created an education system that was based on manufacturing. You gave kids you put them into rows, put them into certain levels, move them up at certain grades. If you deviate, you give them all the same tests, all the same textbooks. That's a manufacturing model. And when you have vast populations coming into a system, you have to organize it in a way from the models that you have in your head. And those models evolved over the same time that the manufacturing, and Taylor was developing his manufacturing models. And those manufacturing models really permeated the organization. We got an organization chart where you have design, manufacturing, research. All these things are boxes, and you pass it off. And so our whole society is developed over concepts and thoughts that were actually developed in the late 19th, early 20th century. And we've been living with that all the time. Well, the first real model that has changed us, I think, is the internet, the network idea. And so, I mean, even our enemy today is a networked enemy. I mean, everything we could think about today, you're here to network. I mean, I was just at a conference in Las Vegas, and people said, I know, first of all, the reason you're here is to network. I mean, it's if you hear it at a conference. They didn't mean get online with your email, but what's the first thing you do? Here's my email address. I only have my email address on my card anymore. I mean, don't send me anything, right? I mean, you email people. It's regis@regis.com. So, I mean, you can find, everybody knows it, Anyway, so I think this model of what we call research has to change, and it has to be much more open and networked, and all of us are all research activity today is going to become nodes on a network.
I have a question about something that moves a lot slower than this industry. I've been watching...
Me.
Not even slightly, sir.
Okay.
I've been watching the development of a variety of products and services fairly closely over a 40-year span. This business moves on its external surface very, very rapidly. However, business models and business strategy move on a time frame of 25 to 50 years.
Right.
100. Culture moves on 100 to 200. And we're trying to feed products and services into cultures that are changing relatively slowly. Even ours changes relatively slowly. What does the research side, the development side, the creative side of marketing, which I see as the development of human relations, need to be doing to take into account how slowly these other things move?
I mean, first of all, we start off with sort of a semantics and a cultural difference, because that's not how I define marketing. But so everybody has different definitions, and same with culture. I mean, culture, I define it, probably my definition is different than yours, but mine is, it's what we learn to do in order to survive in any particular environment. And if we think about that activity, I still think that we change much more rapidly than we think we do. And I suppose the culture, we might say today, is connected, for good or for bad. It's connected culture. And I was describing this to some young graduates recently at the commencement, and I said, in 85, 86, I got a call from Steve Jobs, and it was, I got to see, come on over here. It was a Saturday morning, and he wanted me to go over to Stevens Creek and go to this little room where there was he and a bunch of engineers working over a scope and a circuit card, and the scope was dancing some lines on it, and they're all excited, or something. I was doing something, I don't remember exactly, but they were all excited, and I'm sitting here going, how can I use this thing, you know? And so, you know, they were all excited about what they had done, and were showing me the, you know, the speed and the ability to do this, these basic functions on this little breadboard. And now fast forward 85 to 95, fast forward 20, 25 years. I'm riding in Hawaii. This is the first opening of my book, but I'm riding in Hawaii. We go there every year with our family, and my two granddaughters are in the back seat. My father-in-law, who's 84, who's using a computer. He passed away this past year, but used the computer. He got it when he was 80. My two grandkids, and I said to them, Molly's 8, and her cousin is 2 years older, 10. And I said, what do you want for Christmas? And they said, IMAX. This was 2 years ago. I said, IMAX. I said, oh, well, you know, I'm trying to sort of dissuade them to this because I have a PC and I needed some company. And we're very close. They all live near me. And I said, why don't you, you know, there's not a lot of software, because when you go into Fry's, where we take them to Fry's, you know, you just go down those aisles, and there's all these rows and rows and rows of software on the PCs. Have you ever thought of, you know, maybe we got to go and look at that? And let's see, Molly, she's now 8, so this was 2 years ago. She was going on 7. She said, we don't need software. And my father-in-law looks at me, I'm driving up, you know, and she said, we can go on the internet and get everything we need. And my father-in-law looks at me and he goes, dummy. Is that a cultural change? And that, I mean, fast forward. I mean, think about that. From breadboard to that. From, you know, I realize that I'm an old guy here, but, you know, from this to this, did the culture change of the semiconductor industry? You bet it did. It became this. They don't manufacture these. This is a service business. Since this and this, you know, as Charlie Spork once used to say, you know, in the transition between this and this, the semiconductor industry did more for Southeast Asia than the Korean and the Vietnam War. We taught them how to manufacture things and create jobs, and now it's a much more productive society. Culture change? I think so. The internet? Culture change? I think so. Now, we may not like it, and we may say people don't change very much, but I use an ATM. I use a computer. People that I know, my brothers, who one's in the Philippines, they've never touched computers. They're all, you know, we've all been laborers and so forth and so on, not raised as engineers. Most of them have high school degrees. They all use computers. Everybody I know uses computers, and they're not here. They're in Pittsburgh, or they're in the Philippines, or they're in New Jersey. They all use computers. 40% of cell phones used by third world countries are bought by third world people in third world countries in the last 3 years. I think we're seeing, it's like productivity. They don't recognize it till 10 years later. It's there. And in fact, you know, the Nobel Prize winner, who was 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, you know, he said that all of this IT has done nothing for productivity. And now 10 years later, we're saying, well, now it's, you know, 60, 70, 80% of the contributions to all the productivity gains in the world today. So we don't recognize the cultural change in ourselves. I mean, I don't agree with you. I think we are changing. Now, the structures, the institutions, tend to follow people. They don't lead them. Education follows people. Government follows. So I say here, it's the same thing. They follow the changes. They don't lead them. And so I think that the changes come about and the institutions, because of legacies, because of, you know, legacy systems and legacy, in many cases, regulation and those kinds of things, have a hard time. But, for example, I know people who, for example, have certain diseases where there's prescriptions that you can take or advanced drugs that you can take in other parts of the world. And so as a mobile world, I know they get prescriptions in Europe and they get prescriptions in Japan and other parts for their family members. I mean, so, you know, we're beginning to actually change things that I don't think we'll recognize for 10 or 15 years.
If you think about the growth in productivity over the last couple of decades, as well as improvement in price performance ratios, it seems that most of the people attribute that to Moore's law. And one very interesting fact about Moore's law is that it only predicts a constant growth. It's 2x in 2 years, but it does not do acceleration. So question for you is that based on that fact, do you think we have had accelerated productivity, or is it just a constant growth? And second, if it's accelerated, then what else besides Moore's law is behind that?
Yeah, first of all, there's a little bit of Moore's law is a sort of a reference point. It's analogous. Moore's law existed before Gordon recognized it, right? It's like, Newtonian laws existed before Newton. He made that comment, but from the time that you were able to put a second transistor on a substrate, we had, in effect, doubling. The acceleration, however, has to do not so much with Moore's law, but the fact that the ability to move information from various places. There's a fella, he's the CIO of Brocade, named Jim Cates, a marvelous thinker. And Jim talks about the fact that what we mostly have today is data, not information, and that you essentially have to apply knowledge to get data to become information. And he has these 7 steps to essentially lead to intuition. Intuition isn't, and so the problem we have isn't the acceleration, and I think the technology is accelerating. We are, and I could give you a date on this, I mean, we are doubling the amount of stored information today about every 2 to 3 years. The total world of scientific knowledge today is doubling every 4 to 5 years. And you can look at the growth of data. It's voluminous. We have databases filled with things that people are not using. There's one government satellite's been up there that's been spewing data down for 10 years into databases that no one has put to use or no one has even looked at. It was out there to do environmental types of activity. So, I mean, we have, and in fact, there was a great quote, well, a great quote, it was a terrible quote, but it was made after the Challenger debacle. And one of the engineers said, we were so overwhelmed with data, we lost sight of common sense. So the issue isn't that the technology is going to slow down, it's the application of it and the human application of it. I think that has more to do with the interfaces and not having the technology be able to expand beyond simply gathering and moving information to allow much more access and let the machines do the work for you, if you will. Because, and you can see this happening, application servers, the layering of these things get more and more service-oriented. I was just down in a conference of storage area networks. And when you start looking at storage area networks, it's another layer of how do you manage information. So all the things that are coming out now are about managing the information and creating interface. They call it visualization, virtualization. They got all these terms now for how you better can tap into this information, apply it to specific needs, and do it more economically. So much of in fact, all of the technology is evolutionary. It's the short period of evolution, though, that it's occurring in. I mean, moving from, if you will, the Moore's law that we're going to double all this stuff, certainly in my lifetime, to where we're going to see, it's almost like moving from, the Stone Age to modern man in a very rapid period of time. And if we don't, then in fact we lose out economically and we may lose out socially, because other people will be able to tap in and use that same information that we have and maybe apply it better. So the application has to change in the way we look at information. And that's why I try to say that Moore's law wasn't about the doubling of transistor. It's about creating services. And once you have services, now that's a whole nother world. We don't know much about services. Machines do services better than people, right? And I mean, the ATM doesn't need coffee in the morning, and it doesn't take, a break, and it doesn't go out for lunch, and it doesn't get assigned, I mean, there's all these kinds of things. So that technology is still also new. My biggest complaint with the technology is that it hasn't created great interfaces. The best interface was still the Macintosh in 1985, and we're still dealing with that in Access. Now, there's other access mechanisms. Search engines are getting better. They'll be in everything, I mean, I could probably one day just touch a button here, and you give me a subject, I could put it here, and we could do a search engine. I mean, I think the search engines will become embedded in everything. But those are the kinds of tools that probably in the next 10 years will address your question of not just Moore's Law, but how do we now as humans interface and access what we're capable of interfacing with.
Let's take a couple more.
Relationships are crucial to success, yet the stereotype of the brilliant engineer with no relationship skills is still pervasive. Do you know examples of great ideas, potentially great companies that failed because the key people did not have the relationship skills they needed?
Enron. DEC. I mean, I could go on and on and on, I think, right? I mean, the ability to, and in fact, I hate to say it, but Apple in many ways. I mean, it had an opportunity to build relationships with everybody way back when. And so I think you could look at many, many companies, AT&T, most of the telcos. I mean, try to access companies with a new idea, and that's when you start finding out what the relationships are. And you will, it's very, very, even if you know someone, it's very, very hard. And so I think relationships become extremely important. And actually, I found that the relationships with the technical people are actually much stronger than they are at the business level. And I'll just leave you with one story that was I think was very successful. And this is how these relationships, I could go back and we were doing this with Apple, who knew who to create it in the first place. It was all a family of people that knew each other and relationships, and most of these companies are that way. But a more recent one would be WebLogic. I funded a friend of mine, the engineer, who had this idea of, it was a way out idea. Lived up in the hills in a trailer camp, actually. And I said this idea, and I went up there. I said, "That's a neat idea. I'll give you some money to let's start something." And that's still going. But he introduced me to an engineer who was working out of his home in San Francisco, and had 3 friends, and they were all in their living rooms working in their homes. And we actually sat on the fountain at the Hyatt Regency up there and talked about it. And I had been on Oracle's board, and I had done a lot in middleware and those kinds of things. Not that I understood the technology, but I understood the problem. And so the problem was they were out of money, and they had spent their salaries. So I just sent them a check every month to keep them alive for about a year and a half. I took it to IBM, I took it to HP, I took it to Sun, I took it to Cisco. Not Cisco. I took it to 3 or 4 of the well-known venture capital firms, and everybody turned them away. I bumped into a friend of mine who was at Intel's architecture lab up in Oregon, and I told him about it. And he said, "Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I'd like to come down and see it." He did, and so he said, "This is something we should spend some time with." And so then I was able to call Les Fidesz and say, "Hey, Les, so-and-so," I don't tell you who he is because everyone will call him. But it really was the technical purpose that validated this startup. And they said, "Okay, we'll invest in it." And then the other investors Frank Caulfield came in with me, and then I was helping a friend of mine try to spin a software group out of Lockheed, and I said, "You ought to forget that. You ought to come as president of this." He came as president of this. All of this thing was built around that, and he knew the people at BEA. And so all of those things became, if you will, a development of a technology, and then we realized what it would take to build an infrastructure and said this could take us 5 to 8 years. And indeed, now all of these companies were interested after we developed the application server. So then you know, we made our deal with BEA, a very good deal. But that whole aspect was built on relationships. And I bet every one of you have stories of startups you know, or I could tell you lots of them. I could probably keep you here all night about them. Gordon could tell you a lot too. And I'm sure others in the room about it, about how that is the basis of starting all this. Now, the internet sustains it. The networking sustains it. So customers start first, relationships start there, right? C, R, and M is the management of it. The network is about managing it. You know, I have great friends in Japan. I used to go there periodically, and but I couldn't keep in touch. I mean, because you got to sit down and write a letter. You got to send them a fax or whatever, and you could never communicate. Well, now what we do is we email all the time together. I see deals over here, and in fact, I have a group of my friends showing up tomorrow that I got to pick up, and we're going to go look at a new company. And those are the kinds of things that the internet allows you to do, is to communicate back and forth, to manage the relationship and to keep it alive. It's not something that you create with the internet, although Caliper was started by a bunch of guys that found each other on the internet because they had like research activities going. But by and large, it's the management of relationships and the sustaining of them that it provides. So relationships, I think, will always be important to establish that initial interface that then can be sustained probably longer and more reliably and continuously. It's scalable, if you will, using the internet.
One last question.
Gordon.
Yeah, just a comment. Recently there have been a few
We'll get you.
a few pot shots in Washington about the whole infrastructure problem. Everything you've addressed really has been based on a kind of bottom-up build it with which doesn't require massive infrastructure. Right now, if I had a one worry, I mean, it really is the telecommunications infrastructure, both in Europe and in the U.S. In comparison, the Japanese now have fiber to the home. You are running at video rates, so that you have, one line gets you several or as many HDTV channels as you want, plus, and that whole infrastructure enables a lot of things that we just can't do. I mean, I'm probably one of the few people that are doing streaming, video streaming to the home with the DSL, because we're trying out low codecs, but that's only at T1 speeds, and it just doesn't work in the way that we need it to work to get all that telepresence. I mean, the president of Intel just made a comment, an offhand comment, and then there's been a contingent here. So I'm saying this infrastructure problem is not something the Valley is solving or can solve the way it's going about it. And I say, if we had a really fundamental problem, that's it.
Yeah, I think that it comes down to, we were talking about relationship, it does come down to leadership.
Yeah.
Because, since you're here, you told me to tell a lot of stories, but, back in the early 80s, Bob Noyce, myself, Charlie Spork, and Jerry Sanders went to Washington. And we spent a lot of time, and in fact, this model was developed back in the 70s. And I did an article for one of the Berkeley journals on the economy and how this model was financed. And we used it. I testified in Washington on this model, showing this was the infrastructure and why it was important to sustain that, and how the Japanese model, by blocking market access. Someone has said to me, we were talking about Intel and it's getting out of the memory, but Intel had to get out of the memory business, because when you finance the end here through government debt, if you will, by low interest or no interest loans, you drive people out of markets. And so eventually that caught up with them, but this model was very hard for people to understand, that this was the model of how the U.S. infrastructure was building. And the issues between, say, an SBC and a Cisco's unregulated SBC has to essentially share their investments with their competitors. That whole infrastructure model has to change, and it's not just a change in terms of the technology. The technology, I feel, can accomplish what we need to do, the people who derive the technology. It's that there isn't the leadership, I think, today to essentially articulate. People don't, I think, appreciate how much Bob Noyce, he didn't want to move to Austin. He did that because he was patriotic. And I will tell you that in 1983, Intel was out of cash. They were getting out of the memory business. They decided to go in the microprocessor business. Jack Keeler was very much involved in most of the IBM people in the American investment in technology and in the infrastructure. And IBM bought, was it 18% of Intel, poured in cash, put it in technology because of patriotic reasons. I just talked to Jack last week. He's on the board of a company with me, and he said, "You know why we did?" I said, "Yeah, Jack, you told me that back then. You did it to save the semiconductor industry for America, for American interests." And that was a patriotic move. We don't sort of have that today. And so if the appeal is anything here, we're looking at history, and history is a dialogue. We forget this, and we've got to somehow or other think about this not just as turning technology and investing in new people who have great ideas, which they do, but we got to invest the knowledge, I think, that we have back into this infrastructure. And that knowledge is probably as valuable as any investment venture capitalists can make. So you're absolutely right, Gordon. And it's unfortunate that we just don't have a lot of industry. I mean, I can do it. I'm active in politics, but we really do need the leaders of industry to step up to this because they represent asset base and voters and money that turn the tide.
Reed, just one final question over here.
Yeah. Since we're short on time, I'll keep it short and we can pick it up afterwards. I'm curious to see what you want to say to the audience about this. I'm looking at your model, thinking about the comments about corporate culture and about the last mile is really what you're talking about, as far as broadband infrastructure, for example. For the last several years, I've been doing what I would call the first mile, corporate data centers, corporate internal digital infrastructures. I've been calling myself an infrastructure architect for that period of time. If you type that in Google, you get me within the first few links, which is really scary because I'm just me and my wife. We came here tonight partially to see what you might have to say about this. If the right hand of that model is e-service and application providers, and if so much of this valley has been doing exactly that for the last few years, why is it that I come up so high in the Google ranking, and why is it that we've had so much trouble over the last few years trying to market the concepts of doing basic good infrastructure architecture, mature infrastructure standards and procedures inside of corporate environments? That's the reason why I chimed in so much when we were talking about corporate change a while ago. Because what I've seen is that the mentality still in most organizations, and this is getting into what you're talking about holistic approaches to, in your case, marketing, in my case, IT. The mentality in most organizations is to consider corporate IT as a cost to be avoided rather than a strategic asset. When, in fact, when you're doing things that are towards the right half of that model, that corporate IT is it's the service, it's the infrastructure you're using to deliver the digital service that you're talking about tonight.
Well, first of all, my model isn't about the valley moving in that direction. It's the fact that it actually spans this.
Different, yeah.
And that most of the valley is right here. There's certainly room representatives, but that we share with the people across the country, and quite frankly, the research comes from lots of places. And that most of this ends up here. Remember, Genentech was a startup that used Stanford and University of California and City of Hope's technology or science, but they used Eli Lilly's manufacturing, and now they're owned by Roche. So that's the trend that it goes. What you're talking about, though, I don't agree with you. I think there are, I just happened to have come from Las Vegas last night where I talked to a room like this filled with CIOs, and they are dying to, I mean, they love marketing. They love to be in it. They are champions of building that infrastructure. I think that we tend to label people, and we put them in that label, and we don't like them out of it. And actually, that's what my book is about. I call the CIO the best and the most important marketing person in your organization, because they're the ones that sustain the infrastructure. And what we as customers really want is we want service. We want, you know, I went into a bank last Saturday, and there was a line of 20 people, and I'm standing there. The computers were down. And this guy walks in the door, and he goes, "What is this, Argentina?" You know, I mean, so all, you know, so, you know, I think when you put your credit card in, or whenever you get something delivered at your door, or whenever, that's the service. That's all supplied by somebody who's maintaining the information interchange system. You don't call that marketing? Why do we call, I mean, what do we call that? What do we call the guy who designs a really wonderful product that's very flexible and modular and adaptable and is easy for us to use? We call them a design engineer? I think they're a great marketer. So labels really don't count to me. You know, my label for 40 years, as most people know, is himself.
Right.
And I get people writing me, you know, for that card, right? I mean, everybody knows that.
Right.
In the industry. So I don't like labels. I think that everybody, you know, when you're in a startup, and I learned this back at National. I bought the first burn-in oven at National. I was a marketing guy. I didn't know what a burn-in oven was, but there was no purchasing agent. I actually went out and hired the purchasing because I knew the guy from another company, and I said, "Hey, here's a great guy," and you know, he was French and Pierre was French, so I introduced him, and he hired a Frenchman. You know, I mean. You do what you have to do, right? I mean, and in startups, I always found that the people who run the company and the engineers, it used to complain at Intel that the engineers spent more time in front of customers than they did in the labs. And so you begin to wonder, well, you know, really who contributes to the interface with customers? If marketing really is the producer-consumer relationship, the broadcast media has distanced it, just like I gave you the RCA example. When I go out over television, you are a rating point. When I have to talk directly to you, or when I have to design something for you, or you have to design to me, now I have to adapt. And the minute I have to adapt, I'm in the service business. And so I think the CIOs, and I did spend a lot of time over the last 3 years doing a lot of talking and research with the CIOs. Branding is in their language. Strategy is in their language. Talk to the CIO at Starbucks. Or talk to the director of research of Almondon Labs. He's talking about value and customers and customer value. And that's the way technical people talk about Garden. I mean, I've known him for years. I mean, we never talked about, hey, this is really neat technology. It's what customers use.
Right.
And they understand that because they've been calling on customers for years in the technical business. Now, I think we're going to transfer that into the consumer world where things were much more abstract, much more distant, much more inhuman. I mean, it was not a human environment. Father comes home from work after having worked all day and be in a mill, and is laid off every 3 years because the unions, even if he doesn't want to, I mean, this was not a human environment. And you know, I think we are heading toward a possibility of having a much more human environment where relationships are important and where you don't define yourself as, hey, I'm the only one here, but I'm defined by my relationships. And so one of the definitions I give to marketing is Metcalfe's law. That marketing is the square of the number of relationships that you and your business build in your infrastructure. Because everybody you touch is a distributor in the information age. You don't have one channel anymore, it's everybody.
Right.
And you can just simply see it by the growth of companies in this area, by the numbers of developers. You look at the numbers of developers they sign up, and you will see their market share. Their relationships decline, so does their market share.
Regis, thank you very much. Great lecture. Thank you. On behalf of everybody, Regis, we have a very small gift, just appreciation from the Computer History Museum.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone for attending this evening, and Cynthia, the whole association, and all of our new friends. Thank you for coming.
I got to put these away before.